out on such a miserable afternoon. Today I'm going to speak a little bit about helping and harming was the title that I gave to this talk. Some of the ethical dilemmas of humanitarian action. And I think it's a really good subject to talk about here at Duke University, because so many people are engaged in wanting to do good and in other parts of the world. And I certainly don't want to dampen anyone's enthusiasm for doing so, because after all, I'm still here after 15 years of working in the field and still, banging my head against a brick wall sometimes, but still very much committed to the idea of humanitarian action, despite some of the negative effects that can occur from this action. So what I really want to do today is just sort of open your eyes to some of the dilemmas that we face in international humanitarian relief, and some of these issues will, I'm sure, strike a chord with all of you in your lives and your work, not necessarily applicable to humanitarian relief, but in all sorts of activities. And so that's what the objective of today really is. So the thing about humanitarian action is it was imbued with an essential paradox at its heart. So it is inescapable for humanitarian action not to have fundamental consequences or a paradox contrary to what it is intended to do. If you think back to the birth of sort of modern humanitarian activity, which was the idea of the Red Cross going out and saving wounded soldiers from the battlefield, this very gesture was formalized in international law, that wounded combatants would be spared, would be rendered hors de combat, that nobody was allowed to kill a wounded combatant, and you could have these teams of medical assistants who would also be protected, who could come out and save them from the battlefield. But never at any time was a law enacted to say that these people could not return to the battlefield once they were cured, once they were fixed. And so, in many ways, that very initial act ends up with the potential of prolonging war as we help to fix up the combatants and send them back into the heart of conflict. And I think you can most visibly see this when you look at Sudan. The story of the ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross, in Sudan during the 23-year civil war with the South, when ICRC ran a surgical hospital in Lokichokio, Kenya, and would run a service where planes would fly in and collect people from the battlefield and then take them back to Lokichokio, where they would be fixed up. And then what was ICRC to do with them after they'd been fixed? Well, it then took them back into the field in Sudan, and they were able to nominate the place that they would go back to. So, and then even if we look today in Darfur, we could make a similar analogy, because the ICRC has a flying surgical team that flies all around Darfur when called upon by rebel commanders, when they have a lot of injured soldiers. I would like to say to you that it was injured soldiers and civilians, but the reality is that mostly if a commander calls and says they are wounded, it's more of concern to the combatants, unfortunately. But so the ICRC will fly in. And rather than flying out the patients to be treated in a hospital on the outskirts, ICRC will actually perform surgery in the open air in Darfur, and has been doing so for the last 5 years. So it's a pretty incredible action that's being undertaken. And really, the Sudanese government gets a lot of bad press, and often with very good reason, but it is incredible that, when you think about it, that the Sudanese government gives permission for the ICRC to do this, because after all, it is helping the rebels who are opposed to Khartoum. But that shows the extent to which ICRC has managed to convince Khartoum of its neutrality, and that this is a humanitarian gesture, and that it should be allowed. And of course, the ICRC offers to the Sudanese government to do the same thing for it. But the Sudanese government doesn't need the ICRC's help. It has very sophisticated government structures which it can take its wounded soldiers to. And so it really is an act which is benefiting pretty much just one side on this occasion in Darfur. And that really brings me to the whole idea that, in spite of the fact that under international law, humanitarian action is not supposed to constitute any interference in conflict, in reality, of course, it does. It is impossible to say that humanitarian action is not at some point aiding one side or another. if we look back at South Sudan during the 23-year civil war, the government had people held in garrison towns. The government controlled the garrison towns, and the rebels, the SPLA, etc., held great swathes of the countryside. So any aid that was brought into the garrison towns helped the government keep the people in there, and and stopped attempts of the SPLA from blockading these towns and starving it out. And then any aid that went into the rural countryside helped the SPLA in many ways, because they were able to divert some of it and feed their soldiers. So in these sorts of circumstances, it's very difficult to say that humanitarian action has absolutely a neutral impact on the situation. Nevertheless, I am a firm believer, particularly for the ICRC, that the most effective way to work inside an armed conflict is to try and have as neutral as possible intentions and to think about all these actions. But I will come back to that.